Hi everyone. Fraser and I are going to be talking about securing OAuth 2. Just a quick slide on who we are. We're both at BlackBerry. I used to be a software engineer and written plenty of vulnerable code in my time. Moved over to security back in 2004. Fraser is former pen tester and moved into the security research group at BlackBerry. Contact details are on the bottom, but we'll share the slides at the end. In terms of what we're going to look at today, just going to go over the basic protocol, so roles, tokens, clients, and endpoints, and then have a look at the different what are called grants. They're basically different ways that you can use OAuth to ultimately have authorization to use resources somewhere else. Then we're going to have a look at attacking different implementations. There's a massive OAuth threat model with 50 odd something threats, but we're just going to have a look at some of the stuff that's specific to OAuth and some of the protocols. So specifically around user authentication, redirect URIs, and some cross-site request forgery attacks that exist in the protocol if it's not implemented correctly. Having done that, we'll briefly touch on some of the other attacks that exist, and then have a look at how you need to secure it from the different endpoints or the different roles within it. In terms of definitions, I need to throw these up because, strictly speaking, OAuth is an authorization protocol. So that is determining whether a user or process is allowed to access a particular resource. It's not actually specified as an authentication protocol, which is identifying who you are. All of that is actually left out of the standard. So just so that we're clear, we're going to be talking about both within it, but that's why I've put the definitions up. And so over to Fraser for the overview.
Okay, so what is OAuth 2? It's an authorization protocol. So it basically allows one party to authorize another party to perform actions on their behalf. It consists of 4 roles. So we've got the resource owner, which is us, the user. We've got the authorization server and the resource server, which provides some form of service to the user. And then we've got a client, which we want to also authorize to access this service on our behalf. So OAuth allows the resource owner to authorize the client to perform operations on their behalf at the resource server, and the authorization server is the mechanism used to provide this authorization. So the resource owner has an account at the authorization server. So for all of our examples, we're going to be using a webmail provider. So they've already got an account there. They're using this to send and receive email. And the resource server provides APIs for common operations on these on this account. So 3 examples there. You've got list, read, and send mail. There's some form of implicit trust relationship between the resource server and the authorization server. So this is often the fact that they're just the same system. And then you've got the client, which offers a service that uses these APIs. So in all of our examples, it's going to be mailrobot.com. And the idea is this is an AI that logs into your email account and sends and receives email on your behalf. So the advantage of OAuth is that it allows the client to access the resource owner's resources without them handing over their password, which allows them to control the scope of the actions they're allowed to perform. And the mechanism by which they do that is the access token. So the main advantage is, so if you're handing over your password to the client, they can do anything for all time. If you give them an access token, you can restrict that to say, I only want you to be able to do these 3 things. So once the resource owner has said to the authorization server, I want to give the client access, the authorization server can say to the client, here's a token that allows you to access these 3 functions. This can be given an expiry, so you can limit it to only allowing access for a week. And you can refresh this, so after a week it goes back and asks for another access token. You can also revoke, so the resource owner at any time can say to the authorization server, I don't want them to have access anymore. And then when the client tries to use the token they've been issued, the resource server can say, sorry, that's been revoked, you're not allowed access anymore. So, touch upon tokens briefly. There's three main types. So, access token is the main one. It's created by the authorization server. It's issued to the client and is used by the client to access the resources of the resource server. So, this is multiple use until it expires. When it does expire, we've got the refresh token, which again is created by the authorization server and issued to the client, and is used to request a new set of tokens from the authorization server by the client. Now, this can either be single or multiple use, so you can use the same token to refresh every time a refresh occurs, or you can also refresh the refresh token every time. This is also optional, so you can do it without. And we've also got the authorization code. So this isn't always used in every mode of operation, but it's created again by the authorization server issued to the client, and is used by the client to exchange for an access token at the auth server. This is a single-use short-lived token, and it's not used in every single mode of operation. So I'm going to take a quick look at the communication between the three parties, so basically how this works. So the first thing the resource owner does is goes to the client and requests that they have their webmail account connected. The client redirects the resource owner, the browser, off to the authorization server, and at this point they authenticate and authorize. So authenticate is login. Authorize is typically a confirmation prompt like the one on the screen there, so you press yes to say you want to give access to these parts of your account. They then get redirected back to the client with the authorization code. Gets handed off to the client. And then the client opens a direct connection to the authorization server and sends off this code that is received. The authorization server responds with the access token and the refresh token. And now we've got an access token. The client can make API calls to the resource server for as long as it's valid. Then some time passes, the access token expires, and then we can use the refresh token to get a new set of tokens back off of the authorization server. So this connection on the right here is performed directly between the client and the auth server. So that leads to two different types of client. So we've got ones that can store secrets and one that can't store secrets, and that controls whether this connection is authenticated or not. So a confidential client is one that's able to store secrets. So this is typically a server-side application. So this is able to store secrets, so the authorization server can authenticate all the connections, and that's done using a client secret. And then the opposite of that is ones that can't store secrets, so that's a JavaScript application running in a browser, and that's a public client. So the client secret is something that's created at registration time. So once the developer develops their client, they go to the service provider, the authorization server, and sign up their client. They create a secret, which is then used multiple times, possibly until for the lifetime of the client, to do this authentication. We've also got the concept of endpoints. So these are basically the URLs at the authorization and resource server where things happen. So we've got the authorization endpoint, which is where the user logs in and authorizes. Token endpoint, which is where the client exchanges its tokens. So auth code for access and refresh for access. And then the resources, which is the stuff the client wants to access. So this is a combined authorization and resource server, or you can split them and have auth on the left, resource on the right. So now we're going to take a quick look at our demo application and just show how this works. So this is our demo app, Mail Robot. Offers two sign-in options. So you've got the local sign-in option, so you're using your Mail Robot credentials to sign in, or you can sign in using webmail. So we sign in. You then ask to associate your webmail account. So clicking on that directs us off to webmail, where we sign in using our webmail account. Authorize the access. And then this returns our authorization code. This step usually would probably just happen straight away. We've broken it out just to demonstrate it. So once the client receives the auth code, it makes a direct connection to the auth server to exchange the authorization code for an access token, and then call the API. And then the result of the API can be seen here. So we've just got a simple JSON API that's been called. So we're now going to take a look at some of the grants, the modes of operation.
So a lot of the original OAuth spec was written primarily for web servers, and so either web server side applications or JavaScript based applications. For that, there's actually there are 4 different types of authorization grants. These are just the modes of operation for OAuth. You have the authorization code, which is the one that Fraser has already walked through, again, mostly used for server-side web apps where they can make direct connections to the server. You then have what's called implicit. This is used for client-side JavaScript apps that don't have any server-side components. There are 2 others. One is the resource owner password credentials. This is sort of written as an intermediate one where you actually hand over your credentials to the authorization server, to the client, get it right, and then it will actually use your credentials to get access tokens and refresh tokens. It's sort of an intermediate one that allows you to migrate, say, a native app to a more web-based focus. The last one is the client credential grant, and this is literally for the client to be able to go to the authentication server and the resource server and be able to access resources for itself. So in the instance of, say, Mail Robot, maybe there is a global directory that exists on webmail that you don't need to be authenticated for, and it could use that to actually access them. In terms of what they look like, that's the authorization code flow with the various components within it. One important thing to sorry. Everything, a lot of the, all of the authorization code flow is controlled through redirect URIs. So you'll see a lot of the information bouncing back from the client and the auth server via the browser. It's just worth pointing that out for talking about later. On the implicit flow, so this is the one that's different from what Fraser demonstrated earlier. The main difference. Everything is the same up to and including the authorization point. Sorry. Okay, yeah, up to the authorization point here. But rather than redirecting an authorization code here, what happens is an access token is passed back in the anchor tag of the URI. And then that's actually picked up by the client-side JavaScript from the DOM. So that's the main difference. There is no direct connection from the client to the authorization server, but then the client side will then use the access token to access the resource server directly. In terms of the resource owner password credential grant, quite a mouthful. The resource owner provides the credentials to the client. There is no authorization step here. It will just the client will use them directly to connect to the auth server to get access tokens and refresh tokens. And the scope is actually the set of allowed actions. In this case, that's fully controlled by the client. And then, having got an access token, it will then use it to get resources and do things on behalf of the user. The client credential grant, pretty straightforward. Client connects to the auth server, is authenticated using the client ID and client secret that we talked about earlier, and then is given an access token. And then from there, it can connect to the resource server to access whatever resources it wants as itself. When it comes to native clients, so here we're talking mobile apps and desktop apps, there are 3 authorization grants that are possible, but only one has actually been specified in an RFC, which is the authorization code flow, but it's been adapted for native clients. The clients still use redirect URIs to get information back from the browser. So the idea is the user authentication and authorization on the auth server, or say on webmail, always happens through a browser, and then the browser has to then pass either the authentication code or the access code back to the client. Now, on Android and iOS, you have custom URIs and the ability to claim HTTPS URIs within the OS. But on Windows, you're looking at loopback interfaces, and there's some interesting challenges in here that we don't go into too much, but they're not unique. So unlike URLs in the browser, you don't actually guarantee you'll go back to the right client because you can have multiple apps registered with them. In terms of what the authorization code flow looks like, because the app is a public client rather than a confidential client, it can't authenticate to the authentication server. It's a very similar flow, but there's a couple of extra bits here that are called PKCE, and basically the client creates a secret here, sends a hash of that secret via the user agent, ultimately to the authorization server, and then when it's redeeming the authorization code here, it provides the original value. And the idea is to tie together these 2 requests, effectively bind those 2 requests. Other than that, that flow looks exactly the same as the authorization code flow for a web app. Only obviously these redirect URIs are redirecting from a browser to a native app.
So in one method, you can't, if the client doesn't have a secret,
yep,
then there's no client checking. So you can't do any source checking for that client connection.
Yep.
But if there's a secret, you can, because obviously they are the secrets.
Yes. Yeah, so just to recap, there's 2 types of clients. There is a confidential client, and that is a client that can keep a secret. Because it can keep a secret, you as the authentication server or webmail can authenticate said client. There are also public clients. Those are native apps or apps that live within the client-side apps that live within the browser. For those, you can't authenticate the client because they can't store a secret. Historically, there have been a bunch of native apps that had secrets embedded into them, and there's been papers on that, and people have since moved away from that as an idea because it was relatively easy to reverse engineer the app, pull out the secrets. So that's the protocol at a high level, and now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the protocol level issues that exist within it if it's not implemented either correctly on the client or the authorization server, so either on webmail or on MailRobot. Briefly touched on this in the introduction. There's a massive threat model for OAuth. If you're either implementing your own authorization server or implementing your own client, it's well worth a read because it has a set of different threats that apply to different scenarios, and then a set of recommended countermeasures and mitigations. And if you walk through that, it's pretty comprehensive and should cover you against most things. So, first thing we're going to talk about is user authentication. Initially, OAuth was meant to authorize a user to access resources, but a number of people thought that they could also use it to authenticate a user. So in this case, the the resource server, so in this case webmail, has to provide some kind of identity API where you can go, where a client can go and say, okay, cool, I've got this access token or I've got this authorization code, who are you? And then you can get back identity information for that. So that's like the dialogue here with this sign into webmail option. Now, if you're implementing this as an authorization server, you have to be able to bind either the authorization code or the access code to the client that it was issued to. Because if you can't, you can swap clients. So a malicious client may be able to use a token from a different user. We'll go through the flows for this in a minute. Authorization code wise, you as the authorization server, so webmail, have control within that pattern, because if you can bind an authorization code to a client, which you can through the flow, you will see an authorization code being used from a malicious client. If you can't, on the implicit flow, unfortunately you can't, and we'll show why that doesn't work now. So if as an attacker, there's a malicious client. So in our instance, we're going to have evilmailrobot.com. Could be anything. It could be another client that just has a sign in through webmail option, and somehow the attacker, through phishing or whatever, convinces the user to connect to this client. The user then goes through standard implicit authorization flow and authorizes the malicious client. And at that point, the authorization server will send back an access token. But in our example, rather than using that access token to actually access resources, we just pull it out of the DOM and send it to the attacker-controlled server. So at this point, the attacker has an access token that allows them to access resources on that user's behalf for their client. But because the access token isn't bound to a client, the attacker can then connect to a valid client, so that in this instance, MailRobot, and go through the standard OAuth flow. But when it gets to the access token, just swap out the one that he got from the original user. At this point, the attacker goes to the client. The client trusts the access token and goes, "Who are you?" At this point, that access token has been bound to the original user, not the attacker, and so you get the user information back for that user. Client goes, okay, I know who you are. You're the user, and the attacker's logged in as the user. And to make that hopefully a little bit clearer, Fraser will demo that.
Okay, so now we've got on the right is our attacker, and on the left is the victim. So the attacker's cloned MailRobot and created evil MailRobot. So the first thing we want to do is get the client or the victim to log into their evil client. So launch a phishing attack. So now they're on evil MailRobot, and they go to sign in using their webmail account. We're already signed in from earlier, so it's just going to ask us to authorize. So we authorize and get an access token back. Now at this point, because the attacker controls evil MailRobot, they have this token. So the attacker can go to the real site, follow the same flow, log in using their webmail account, authorize. And now they can substitute the code that they've stolen from the victim. And now the client's gone away in the back end, and it's made a request to the resource server asking who does this access token belong to, and it's responded with user 1. So now we're trusting that response. the valid client has trusted that information, and now we're logged in as the attacker as user 1. So next we're going to look at some attacks that use the redirect URI.
So, as we mentioned in the when we were going through the authorization grants, the authorization code and the implicit code flow redirect either the authentication code or the access token using a redirect URI via the browser. What should happen is that a client should register a full redirect URI with the authentication server, and then during various stages of the grant or the particular flow, the authentication server should check that said redirect URI matches the one that has been registered. If that's not the case, then an attacker can provide their own redirect URI, and obviously at that point they can redirect authentication codes or access tokens to a different server. So in exactly the same way as we were talking last time, with if you launch this stuff through a phishing attack or something of that ilk, you can grab either a code or an access token, and once you have one of those, use it to connect your account to the your account being you, the attacker, to the user that you've stolen it from. So for the authorization code, so the attacker sends a phishing link to the user, and that looks like a standard request to a standard OAuth flow for a trusted client. Worst case scenario, if the user is already logged into the client, all of this could actually happen in the background without the client knowing. At which point, the auth server will then issue a code back to the user agent, but rather than redirecting as it should do to the client, based on the redirect URI that came in here, it's redirected back to the attacker. At which point, the attacker has a valid authorization code, runs through a standard login with the client. So this would be Mail Robot, and rather than using the code from the code that was issued to the attacker, he switches the code out for the one that he obtained from the victim, and at this point, he's logged into it. That will then be used by the client, so Mail Robot, to connect to the auth server and access the user's mail resources. In terms of how that looks on the implicit flow, same mechanism, phishing link. You go through the OAuth flow, and you get redirected, but rather than stealing an authorization code, because this is the implicit flow, you steal an access token instead. And then once you have said access token, the attacker goes through the same OAuth flow with the client, substitutes the access token here, and at which point the client application running in the attacker's browser is accessing resources on the resource server as the user. And Fraser's going to demo that one now.
So in this attack, we're assuming that the user is already signed in to their Mail Robot account. At which point the attacker is going to sign into their Mail Robot account, and then going to take the link that's used to redirect to connect to your webmail account. Going to seal that, and then within this link is the address that we want the authorization code to go back to. So the attacker can change this from Mail Robot to Evil Mail Robot. throw a phishing attack to get the user to execute this link. Yes. And the authorization code goes back to evil mail robot, so the attacker's got this code. They can then follow the same legitimate flow on here and substitute the code for the one they've taken from the victim. That's exchanged for an access token. Access token is used to call the API. And we have the attacker's account at MailRobot associated with the user's account at webmail.com. So now they're free to access any of their resources. So the next one we're going to look at is cross-site request forgery.
So there's the ability to do a cross-site request forgery against the authorization response in the protocol. The protocol actually talks about this in the RFC, and there's mechanisms for dealing with it in using a state parameter, which is exactly the same way as you deal with any cross-site request forgery attack normally. The thing that's slightly different about this one is the consequences. It allows it's the complete inverse of the other two attacks that we've demonstrated, and it allows the attacker to connect their resources at the resource server to the user's account on MailRobot. So if I, as a user, had logged into MailRobot and this attack was performed against me, it would be the attacker's account that I'd be sending mail through or listing mail. So there may be circumstances, depending on the APIs, where an attacker could use this to monitor actions that are happening from a particular client. In terms of how it actually works, assuming the user is already logged into the client here, the attacker walks through a standard OAuth flow to grab an authorization code that they need, and then they do a blind post either through phishing or a hidden iframe on another website to the redirect URI. So this is the authorization response from the user to the client. At that point, the client goes, okay, that's an authorization code. I'll switch to using this account. And so even though the user is logged in here to client, the resources that are accessed on the resource server get swapped, and now the client is using the attacker-controlled resources. Briefly to touch on it, because we don't go back to these diagrams later, what should happen is when the client in terms of mitigating this, when the user's browser makes this request or this redirect, there should be a state parameter in here. State parameter then goes from the client to the user's browser to the auth server and then is returned here, at which point the client can validate the state parameter here is the same one that it issued here. Just wanted to show that because we don't go back to this later. Same idea with the implicit one. User is logged in, OAuth flow, and then you pass in the access token through cross-site request forgery here, and the application swaps to using the attacker control resources. So Fraser's going to demo that.
So in this attack, we've got the victim signed into their account on MailRobot, and we've got the attacker also signed into their account. So they're going to follow the implicit grant, which returns with an access token. So this URL here contains the access token. So again, we launch a phishing attack to get our victim to execute that URL containing the access token that was issued to the attacker. So now the user has this goes through. And because that access token was issued to the attacker, we've now associated the user's account with the attacker's account on webmail.com. So any email that's sent or received is going to be sent via their account. All they need to do is go and log in directly, and they can view the sent items to see what the user's tried to send. So we're now going to take a look at some more attacks.
So one of the other side of OAuth is it's about granting authorization. So in exactly the same way that an application on Android or iOS can ask for too many permissions, a client can ask for too many permissions. So in this example, life, the universe, and everything, it may be asking for additional access to your calendar, various other parts depending on what functionality is available on the resource server. You also, obviously clients have names, and as soon as you introduce namings for anything, you introduce homograph attacks, so substituting characters, having things that are similarly named. There was actually an incident about 6 months ago where someone did this on Google. They created a client called Google Docs or something of that ilk, and there were various emails flying around where it was just popping up do you want to associate your account with Google Docs? Similar example to this, obviously we have valid mail robot on the right and slightly shoddy dodgy mail robot on the good mail robot on the left, dodgy one on the right. So all the standard authorization problems that you have in any system that's asking for permissions. Just to touch on some of the other areas, client credentials. Obviously, these are passwords. Sometimes it's stored in the clear in the database. They shouldn't in the authorization service database. They shouldn't be. Tokens. There are a few different types of tokens, but assuming you're using a handle-based token, so a random number, these obviously need to be big enough, and if they're not generated from an appropriate cryptographic source, they might be guessable. All the standard stuff that applies to session cookies. Tokens, especially things like the access token, the refresh token, they're equivalent to, they're credentials to get into an account. So if you're storing them in the clear, in the database, a database of the authorization server, you'll have similar problems. The RFC is pretty explicit about using TLS everywhere. If you don't, obviously you've got codes and access tokens flying around. Don't really need to go into any more details than that. And then also you've got all the standard vulnerabilities that exist in web apps and native apps that, if present, may allow someone to steal an authorization code or an access token. OAuth on mobile, I briefly talked about the problem with redirect URIs not being unique. There's also currently no specified way for one application to hand a token to the other application and establish trust. There are ways of doing it, but there's nothing specified, and it's an area that some security white papers have looked into and found various problems in. So for the last bit, we're just going to run through the four attacks we talked about, and basically how it should be secured, and briefly touch on some of the other security mechanisms that you can use. So in terms of user authentication, the key is to for the authentication code, it's about the authorization server has to be able to bind the authorization code to a client so it knows who it was issued to. On the implicit flow, it's actually the responsibility of the client. So the client, there needs to be an interface on the authentication server that allows the client to take an access token and go, was this issued to me? And if not, it needs to be able to throw away the access token and just reject that login. This is actually what some of the big identity providers like Google and Facebook do for their implicit flow. When you're moving to the authentication code on native, the PKCE, that was the additional parameters that I showed of the code challenge and the code going through, and that is allowing binding of 2 requests again. There's also a new spec that's come out in the last probably 2 or 3 years called OpenID Connect. That is building an identity layer on top of OAuth, and it does this by issuing ID tokens in different parts of the flow. So it will issue them alongside access tokens, and these are JWT tokens. They're signed, and within them they have an audience parameter, and the audience is basically the client that the token was intended for. So you as a client, when you receive an ID token, can look at it and go, oh, is that me? And if it's not, you can obviously discard it. In terms of the redirect URIs, from the client perspective, you need to register one, at which point it's pretty much the responsibility of the authorization server to check that the redirect URI at the appropriate points in the protocol is the one that was registered. There's 2 points in the authorization code flow. There's 2 points. The first one is on the first redirect, and then the second one is during the token request. When the client is connecting to the authorization server, it can provide the redirect URI that the code came in on as a secondary check. Same with the implicit. It's down to the authorization server to check it. For the cross-site request forgery, within the RFC for the protocol, there is a state parameter. It's documented that it's intended to mitigate this particular attack. So obviously the client needs to include said state parameter. The resource server needs to send it back, and then the client needs to validate it when it gets the appropriate requests. In terms of granting authorization, a lot of the granting too much authorization or homograph attacks are actually quite hard to defend against. But probably one of the best ways is, as an authorization server, having a sufficiently comprehensive UI that you as a user can manage which applications or which clients you granted permissions to, which resources have been accessed and things like that. So again, if you go back to some of the big identity providers like Facebook and Google, you can go into your account there and you can see which applications or which clients are associated with what features, and for some of them you can actually see what they've been doing as well. In terms of other mitigations, client credentials, we talked about why you should only issue client secrets to clients that can store them safely. Token generation, again, if you're using random tokens, standard web session rules apply. 128-bit minimum, strong PRNG. Storing the token and the client secrets, if they should be hashed. If they're sufficiently high entropy, so 128-bit random numbers, they don't actually need to be hashed using something strong like bcrypt, just because you can't guess. You can't brute force 128 bits, so you could use something quick like SHA-256. There's a lot of binding information I've talked about in the context of the other attacks. There's also we talked about authorization codes being single use. Actually enforcing that on the authorization server, so removing it from, say, the database or the database table once you've used it is a good thing. Within the RFC, there's also a bunch of stuff on actually monitoring. So if you start seeing authorization codes that were issued to one client coming in from another, you then, as an authorization server, you need to be flagging that so that you do then something appropriate. don't know what the something appropriate will vary depending on your policies, but it's something to monitor. Likewise, if you're having refresh tokens that have been issued to a particular client turning up but being used by another client, something has gone wrong. Tokens have leaked somehow. And obviously the classic one, brute forcing against access tokens, refresh tokens, or client credentials. You need to be monitoring for a number of failures and take appropriate steps. Wrong way. The other one is have a revocation strategy. So if a user account is compromised, can you clear all the access tokens, refresh tokens that exist for said account? If a client is compromised, how do you recover from that? For random tokens, so that where they're just a random ID and you always have to go back and look them up in the database, that's relatively straightforward. You can just clear the tokens. But if you are using other tokens, such as signed tokens, where you've got no record of them, and they're controlled by they're signed, and the validation is done just based on public keys, then you have a different problem in terms of revocation. You need to push information to your resource servers or to your authentication servers. And obviously the last one is use TLS. In terms of references, we'll share the slides afterwards, but there's a ton of RFCs about this, and a couple of other papers. These two are really good in talking about the user authentication problem and how it applies to both web and native. And then at the bottom, if you want to see how Facebook and Google do it and the various steps, there's very detailed instructions on how to implement stuff there, and you can see a lot of how they're mitigating a lot of these threats. And that's it. So over to you guys. Any questions?
Are Facebook and Google the kind of gold standard in terms of implementation?
I haven't really looked. It's more a case of they are very big identity. A lot of people have a Google account. A lot of people have a Facebook account. So I don't want to make any comment on the quality or not. I suspect they're very good because they are Facebook and Google. And if they weren't, other people would have looked. But yeah. Yep.
So most of the attacks that you use to demonstrate require you to get the user onto a malicious URL.
Yes.
At that point, can you not just be nicking the creds directly? So rather than just attacking the OAuth, you essentially make a fake login with mail account and just steal the creds.
Potentially, yeah.
Is there anything in the is there anything in the OAuth suite that enables developers to make it so that users can essentially authenticate the login screen, making sure that that they're sending the data to a legitimate service, but not.
So just to rephrase that question, is there anything in OAuth that can be used to prevent phishing attacks? Not really. You're down to the classic training your users to only trust HTTPS sites, validate the URL, etc., etc. Beyond that, there's nothing, unfortunately.
You mentioned about time or any thresholds. Is there anything or limits the attack surface by a number of requests, time, notification?
So you can have just a question for the video. is there anything in the spec that mitigates stuff through time? There are recommendations within the spec and within the threat model for things for the different tokens. So the authorization code is a one-use token, and that, depending on your implementation, you could enforce an expiry time on that fairly short, maybe 5 minutes or so. Access tokens, that's a configuration call based on your decision as an authorization provider. If you're very worried, you can push that down to say an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours. If you're happy with access tokens being around longer, you can push it up. Refresh tokens are the most long-lived ones, and the idea then it becomes a trade-off between how often do you ask your users to re-authenticate and reauthorize versus not. And if you look at how most apps that are using this refresh tokens are a long time. I mean, I don't think I've seen requests to re-authenticate or reauthorize very frequently with apps or websites that are linked. Any other questions? In which case, we're done. Thank you very much.